Hi everyone, it's Nick. Welcome back to my channel. Okay, in this video today, we are going to be talking about color trends for 2023. So it's around this time of year when all the different paint companies sort of release their palettes for what they think are going to be the color trends coming for the new year. So in this video, I thought I would focus on Sherwin-Williams and Benjamin more because they really are kind of the most popular paint companies that are used a lot in design. And they have released palettes for this coming year, and that's what we're going to discuss. They kind of went in a similar, well, no, they actually went in a very different direction from each other, which I think is super interesting. And that's what we're gonna discuss in this video. Now, inevitably, by the way, there's always people that say like, you know, no one's gonna tell me how to paint my walls and like, you know, this is a stupid video, which I always say like, why did you click on the video? Like, I never really understand why people click on things that they are obviously going to disagree with, but that's life on the internet. And then the second thing is you don't have to paint your walls anything. Like whatever you have in your home right now is fantastic. You don't need to paint. But what I think is really great about these palettes is it gives you a lot of ideas and gives you a really strong indication for where design is headed, especially in regards to color. And that really does matter because these sorts of colors, these trends are what ends up showing up in the retailers that you know and love, that you shop at all the time. So yes, you're gonna see at IKEA and Crate and Barrel and whatever, you're gonna see all the retailers start to bring in these types of colors because that's how design sort of moves. It moves in waves and in trends. And if you think that you have no part in that, well, I hate to tell you that, but your sweater is not blue, it's actually cerulean. And if you do not understand that reference, I don't have time to explain it to you. So let's get to the rest of the video. Hi everyone, just dropping in here before this video goes live to let you know that I started a Patreon. So Patreon is a great way for me to do a lot of live streaming and different things where I can answer sort of your questions. You can submit photos from me of things that you're thinking about buying or updates that you want to do to your space, and we can all discuss it in a live stream in a much smaller and more intimate way. So if you're interested, go click on the link and you can come hang out with me. My first live is going to be next week, and we can all chat there together. And yeah, link is in the description. Thanks. Okay, back to the video. Okay, so let's start with Sherwin-Williams. Let's discuss their color of the year and their palette. So their color of the year is called Redent Point. And then they have a few different palettes that they use. I think they do 4, but I really focused on the one that I think makes the most sense and what Sherwin-Williams puts right there on their website. So Redent Point is a really interesting sort of clay-based, kind of tan-colored, rosy pink sort of color. It is a very interesting, beautiful color. I think that this is quite on trend. I think they actually did a really good job with this pick. It is a color that sort of almost feels like it's a neutral because there's enough brown and tan in it that you can definitely use it as a main wall color. But I do think it is a little bit more interesting than just going with something like a sort of plain sort of beigey brown or a taupe color. So it's a little bit rosy, it's a little bit earthy, and I think that's really what works for this particular palette. And the rest of the palette that they picked, I think really does complement Redent Point very well. The other colors in the palette that they have are called Foothills, which is sort of this really interesting, sort of very desaturated green color. It's kind of a greenish gray, but it's actually a little bit darker than your typical green colors, which I quite like. They also have a color called Cool Beige, which to me, I think Cool Beige, I'm gonna be honest, I think it's a bit of a misnomer. I think it's not that cool at all. It's actually a warmer toned beige. I really like this one. I think this one acts a little bit more as the neutral in the palette, but works very well alongside Redent Point. They also have this color Carnelian, which is, I think it's actually probably one of my favorites in the palette, to be honest. It's this very beautiful, dark, sort of eggplant kind of color. This reminds me a lot of what Benjamin Moore did a couple of years ago, maybe with last year, where they did Amazon Soil. I don't know if you remember. I'm obviously a nerd that remembers this stuff, so I remember all the different colors, but Amazon Soil was quite similar. It's like this really sort of dark, sort of purpley eggplant color, and you don't really recognize it as purple necessarily because it's so dark. It's just got so much black in it that it really does feel very dark and moody, but it's just got that little bit of purple undertone to it, which I think works really well with sort of the rosy, clay-based, sort of pinky tones that you see in the rest of the palette. They also have Hushed Auburn, which is, I don't know, I feel like it's very, very similar to the color of the year. I feel like it's a bit redundant in this palette, to be honest, but you know, it's a slightly different sort of tone. I think it's a little bit more gray than Redent Point, but again, quite similar to the actual color of the year, but definitely kind of a not as interesting, but still fine addition to the palette. And then there's Malted Milk, which first of all, it's a really fun name, but Malted Milk, it feels like it's not not quite an off-white, but it's got that little bit of a pinky rosy undertone to it, but still a very, very light color. Still very much in the same sort of category as Reed and Point. So definitely what I'm seeing is that a lot of these colors sort of work, they're very, very similar. They're just maybe have a little bit more white, a little bit more black, or a little bit more sort of gray added to them to make them sort of slight variations of a similar sort of pinky clay base, pinky brown sort of orangey sort of color tone, which they're all sort of subtle variations of that. Then there's Pure White, which I think is just sort of the obligatory white sort of neutral that every single one of these palettes really puts in there. I've noticed that in recent years. I mean, Benjamin Moore years ago did Simply White as their color of the year, which was a bland but sort of, I guess, sort of interesting choice because it was a white. But most of the time, actually Behr used Blank Canvas. They actually went with a white paint this year as well, which is interesting. But most of the time, these palettes always kind of include a complementary white color, and that's what this is basically serving. Then they have Urbane Bronze, which is sort of a nice, beautiful, sort of warm bronzy, obviously, or a warm, very kind of brown tone. This was their color of the year 2 years ago. So that's kind of interesting that it made it back into the palette this year. And then there's Toil Red, which I think is the kind of most saturated and obviously red color in this palette. But I would make the argument that a lot of the colors in this palette lean towards red, orange, or pink, which are really just kind of all in the same family. I think it works really well here too, just because it's this really sort of interesting brick red that you can add into this palette. First of all, I would say that Evergreen Fog, which is last year's color of the year, and all the greens that we've seen before fit really, really well with this year's palette. I've noticed the addition of Urbane Bronze as well as Foothills, which is very, very close to Evergreen Fog in my opinion, except Evergreen Fog was a little bit more obviously green than Foothills, which is a little bit more browny. So the greens and these sort of terracotta reddy tones are really, really complementary because red and green do sit across from each other on the color wheel. And I think the problem with a red and green color palette for a lot of people is immediately they think Christmas. And that makes so much sense, right? You're like, I'm looking at the complementary color schemes and I'm just like, I just don't want my house to look like it's Christmas all year round. And like, I totally get that because I feel the same way. But I would argue that this palette actually lends itself quite well to being a red and green palette, because when you think red and green, don't just think of really saturated red or really saturated green. You also have to think of all the tints, tones, and shades that exist within red and green. So this palette, when you actually think about it, a lot of these reds or reddy oranges or reddy pinks are really just very toned down versions on the color wheel of the red color, of the primary red hue that you might be expecting and visualizing. So take red, add a lot of gray to it, and it starts to look a lot like the color of the year. Add a little bit more white to it and you get something like Hushed Auburn. Add even more white and you start to get something a little bit more like Malted Milk, right? So really it's about playing with all the different colors that exist kind of in this red, earthy, sort of reddish, orange, pinky area of the color wheel and adding different variations of white, gray, and black. And I think that's where a lot of these colors are basically coming from. They're very, very similarly placed on the color wheel. Green, of course, sits opposite red on the color wheel, and that's where you get the color like Foothills or Evergreen Fog, which is not in this palette, but I think works really, really well with this palette. And so again, the green here in Foothills is actually really dark and a lot more like a brown with subtle green undertones in it. So I do think a lot of the green tones that we have seen so popular for the last couple of years will work really well with the rest of this palette. The other thing I think is really important to note about this palette before we get to Benjamin Moore's in a second, which is a very different direction, is it's very cohesive, I think, because these are all very desaturated colors. These colors are very subtle. There's a lot of gray added to them because gray, remember, is just a mix of black and white. So taking some of those reds or greens, adding so much gray into it makes it feel really desaturated, and that's what's going to give you these really sort of subtle, almost pastel colors that are really kind of present in this palette. And that's, I think, a really interesting direction in that even though we keep hearing so much about color, 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 and colors making a comeback and people want more saturated colors, it's really interesting that Sherwin-Williams is still very much playing with those neutrals. I actually think that this palette would appeal to people that love neutrals, but maybe are thinking about kind of dipping their toe into a little bit more color in their space. But they don't want to go crazy. They don't want anything too saturated, which is more going to appeal to the Benjamin Moore palette in a second, but looking at something that's a little bit more neutral, but just with a little bit more color to have a little bit more fun and sort of personality in the space. Okay, so now let's move over to Benjamin Moore's color of the year. Benjamin Moore's palette is very, very different from the Sherwin-Williams palette. Benjamin Moore, I think, has really embraced color and unapologetic color. You know, this isn't color with a lot of gray added to it to make it quite desaturated. This is big, bold, beautiful color, and that's what we're seeing here. So the color of the year from Benjamin Moore is called Raspberry Blush. Now, this is a very bold, in-your-face, beautiful color that is very red. This is like quite floral. This is not subtle. This is a color that is very bold, very vibrant, and has a lot more pigment in it than what we saw from the Sherwin-Williams palette. So a very, very different direction for this one. I think this choice is a bold one. I think what they're trying to say is that color is back. Color is, people are maybe a little bit tired of the kind of soulless, lifeless gray tones that we've seen, and people are maybe moving towards big, bright, vibrant color again, which is sort of the direction that they think that color is headed in the new year, which I think is an interesting prediction. I will say that I think it's a beautiful color. I don't think it's gonna make sense for a lot of people. Call me old-fashioned, but I still do look at a lot of people's houses and they really struggle with moving away from white. That's just the reality. So getting them from white to something like a really sun-baked sort of subtle neutral, maybe a beige with a little bit more color in it, something like what we saw a minute ago from Sherwin-Williams, even that is a challenge for a lot of people, right? A lot of people are really sort of scared of painting their walls big, bright, bold colors. I'm not sure how many cans of Raspberry Blush they're gonna sell at Benjamin Moore, to be honest with you, but I think, you know, philosophically, I think it says a lot about adding color maybe in other ways besides paint, and definitely just this movement and trend towards people bringing in more color into their rooms, which I think is an interesting trend that I do agree we will see more of. I don't know how popular it's going to be, but I'm excited to see some of the designs that are going to be coming out with people using a lot more color. Okay, so let's move through some of the rest of the palette. So next up here, we have Tofino Sunset. First of all, shout out to Tofino, which is just a small town over on Vancouver Island, not far from where I've been. I can tell you, I've been there several times. They have beautiful sunsets. So it is a gorgeous color. So this is going to be a little bit very much like a pink, but it's going to have a lot more white added to it. So Raspberry Blush, a lot more saturated. I would say Tofino Sunset going to be a little bit of a lighter pink. Both of those I think are kind of going to work well together. They're both in the same family. Could be cute for some monochromatic spaces, which could be kind of interesting. Yeah, it's a lighter kind of option, I think, as compared to Raspberry Blush, and I think that makes sense to be in the palette. Next up is Cinnamon. Now, Cinnamon was actually more closer to what I thought they would probably pick for their color of the year. This is a little bit orangey. It's not quite as vibrant as Raspberry Blush is, but I do think it's a really cute, nice color. It got a lot of kind of tan, brown sort of tones in there, but definitely leans a little bit more orange. Okay, so next up here is this beautiful eggplant color. It's kind of a really interesting and dark sort of moody color, quite similar to the color we saw from Sherwin-Williams a minute ago. They had something similar in their palette. And it's this really gorgeous dark eggplant color. This is probably my favorite of the palette, to be honest. I really quite love this one. It's very dark, it's very moody, but it's got such interesting purple undertone to it, which I really love. And again, like a lot of people look at purple and they think like purple, and this is just a lot darker, and therefore it's gonna read to me a lot moodier and a bit more sophisticated, which I do really love. Okay, next up we have Savannah Green, which is this interesting sort of yellowish greenish color. I don't love this one, to be honest. This is always like my least favorite category of color is the yellow green section. I don't know, I think if it leans more green, it can be kind of fun, like October Mist was last year, but when it leans too yellow, it's just a baby poop green to me, which I don't really love. But I'll say this is the moment in the palette where I was looking and I was like, okay, I don't know if Benjamin Moore even wants these colors to be played in the same room. And sure enough, I started looking through all their marketing material. This is actually my main criticism of the palette, to be honest, which is normally I love that these palettes are really cohesive and they make a lot of sense to bring all these colors together. But I would say with Benjamin Moore and all their marketing material, they rarely pair, I will say, some of these big, bold, saturated colors together in the same room. Most of the time, they pair them with the neutral section, which I'm going to get to in a second, which they have these kind of 8 bold colors, which they call their primary sort of main palette. And then they have what's called like sort of neutral pairings that they've added on, which is an additional 4 colors that they feel complement those colors. I think that that's fine. I don't know if I really love that decision, because what I love to see is the whole palette work together, so someone can actually, you know, pick and choose a bunch of different colors and know that they're really going to work well together. That for me is what I love about Benjamin Moore's palette every year. I'm not sure this is it, because when I started looking at Savannah Green and Raspberry Blush and a couple of colors we're going to get to, I was like, I don't know how I feel about bringing all these colors sort of into the same space at the same time. It would take a skilled hand to be able to bring all these colors together effectively. You'd really have to think through that palette and really feel confident in your ability to pair some of these colors together, I think, to really get it right. So this is the moment where I started to become a little bit skeptical that this was going to be a really beautiful, cohesive palette. I think it was going to be an interesting palette, but I'm not sure everything really works well together. Okay, then we have New Age. So New Age here is actually a really beautiful, light sort of lilac color. This, I think, would work very well with the sort of eggplanty purple that we saw a minute ago. I think those two would work really well together. So it's not quite, it's kind of almost getting towards an off-white. It's very, very light, but it does have a lot of sort of grayish purple undertones to it. So another beautiful color. And then we got a couple of blues. We have Starry Night Blue, which is a very saturated, very, very saturated dark blue sort of color. I wouldn't say it's dark blue. It's really more of kind of a royal blue or a mid-tone. Obviously, based on sort of the Van Gogh's Starry Night. It is a beautiful color. I think it is very saturated and really speaks to what Benjamin Moore is banking on, which is that people are going to be really gravitating towards big, bold, saturated color this year. Again, I think it's going to be a color like a lot of these colors in the palette that some people will use, but I think it's going to be a challenge to get a lot of people to really buy into this for their own homes. So next up here we have North Sea Green, which sort of occupies kind of this bluish green sort of teal area of the palette, which again is very saturated, sticking with the theme of most of the other colors that I just mentioned. An interesting color. I don't think, again, that it's going to appeal to a wide variety of people, because again, most people really do love to stick to those neutrals and those safer colors. But I think if you have a skilled hand and you're somebody who really wants to play around with color, this could be a cool one to check out for sure. Okay, so then finally we've come to these 4 neutral colors, which are meant to sort of complement those really big, bold, saturated colors that I just mentioned. So we've got Etiquette, White Heron, Gray Owl, and Onyx. So Etiquette is going to sort of fill the spot of being sort of a really sort of light beige color. It is very, very light, but definitely leans warmer and definitely more of a beige than a true white. White Heron, on the other hand, is the one that's meant to sort of occupy the spot of being sort of a true white, because white really does sort of work and complement with the rest of the bold colors in this palette. So it makes sense that they'd have a beige and then they'd have a white. And then they also have a gray, which is going to be Gray Owl. So Gray Owl is, you know, not really quite a mid-tone. It is quite light, but it does definitely have more of a gray or cooler sort of undertone than those other 2 colors. And finally, of course, you have Onyx, which occupies the black spot on the list. So Onyx has an LRV, which if you don't know is called light reflectance value. It's how much light is reflected off the paint. So 0 being true black, 100 being like true white. So this has an LRV of 2.9, so it is very, very dark. It's kind of arguably a little bit of a warmer black, but still very, very dark and really reads as kind of a true black, not even a charcoal. Like this feels very, very black. So you've got kind of a black, white, a beige, and a gray, which makes sense that those 4 neutrals would complement sort of the really saturated colors in the rest of the palette. Overall, I would say where I'm a little bit disappointed, I personally don't love raspberry blush as a color. It's not a color that I would probably bring into my own home, because I do tend to like things that are a little bit more subtle. But having said that, I still do appreciate that there are a lot of really big, bold, cool, funky colors being put in people's homes now, and that is a trend that Benjamin Moore is obviously seeing going forward. So I love that people are having a little bit more fun with color. I love that people are playing with it in sort of interesting and cool ways, and they're just having a lot more fun. And, you know, I will say that a lot of the gray, kind of drab, sort of cool museum-like spaces are getting a little bit tired and just not all that livable and fun, to be honest with you. I think overall though, they took some risks and picked some really bold, cool colors, and I think they should be commended for that as well. So that's it for me for today, you guys. I hope you really enjoyed this video. I'm gonna link to last year's color of the year, because I do think from Benjamin Moore that was a little bit more cohesive, and I also profiled Evergreen Fog and all the Sherwin-Williams colors, which I think you might enjoy, because they do actually work quite well with this year's palette as well. And I will see you all in the next video. So thanks a lot. Bye.